The first gunshot split the air like thunder, sending a flock of startled crows into the Montana sky as Margaret Finley threw herself behind the nearest water trough. Trembling fingers found the knife tucked in her boot, her calloused hands steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. The year was 1876, and Margaret had learned early that the Montana Territory showed no mercy to those unprepared for its harsh realities. "Stay down, miss." A deep voice commanded from somewhere to her right. Another shot rang out, followed by the sound of a body hitting dirt. Margaret peered cautiously over the edge of the trough to see a tall figure standing over a motionless man, gun still smoking in his hand. The stranger holstered his weapon with practiced ease and turned toward her. Sunlight caught in his sandy brown hair and piercing blue eyes studied her with concern. "You all right, madam?" Margaret nodded, slowly rising to her feet, knife still clutched in her hand. "Yes, thank you, mister." "Samuel Keller," he replied, tipping his hat. "That fella's been causing trouble up and down the territory, tried to rob the stage last week." His eyes dropped to her knife. "Good thinking, being prepared. Not many ladies carry protection." "Not many ladies run their own ranch," Margaret replied, sliding the knife back into her boot. "Margaret Finley." Samuel's eyes widened slightly. "The Lazy F. I've heard about that place, heard a woman was running it after her pa passed." He studied her face more intently now. Didn't realize she'd be so young. 22 isn't that young," Margaret countered, brushing dust from her simple work dress. "And I've been helping Pa run that ranch since I was tall enough to reach a horse's stirrups." The sheriff arrived then, interrupting their conversation. After giving her statement and watching the outlaw's body being carried away, Margaret turned to find Samuel still waiting. "Mind if I escort you to wherever you're headed, Miss Finley? There might be more of his kind about." Margaret hesitated. Her wagon was loaded with supplies she'd come to town for, and the incident had delayed her considerably. The sun was already beginning its descent, and the thought of the lonely road back to her ranch suddenly seemed less appealing. "That would be kind of you, Mr. Keller." As they walked toward her wagon, she noticed people staring and whispering. She was used to it. A woman in men's work clothes, running a cattle ranch alone, she'd been the subject of town gossip since her father's death 2 years ago. "Don't pay them any mind," Samuel said quietly beside her. "People talk when they've got nothing better to do." Margaret nodded, but she couldn't help overhearing a woman's sharp whisper as they passed. "Look at those hands, rougher than my husband's. What man would want that?" She instinctively tucked her hands into her pockets. Years of ranch work had left them calloused and tough, with short nails and weathered skin. They were strong hands, capable hands, but not the soft, delicate appendages society expected of a woman. Samuel's expression hardened, but he said nothing until they reached her wagon. As she climbed onto the seat, he mounted his own horse, a magnificent chestnut stallion. "That's a fine animal," Margaret commented, genuinely impressed. "This is Rusty." Samuel patted the horse's neck affectionately. "Best companion a man could ask for out here." The journey back to the Lazy F took nearly an hour. Samuel rode alongside her wagon, and conversation came surprisingly easy. She learned he'd come to Montana 3 years ago, worked as a ranch hand on several spreads, and recently taken on the role of foreman at the Big Sky Ranch, which bordered her own property. "I've seen your cattle," he said. "Fine-looking herd. You've done well considering." "Considering I'm a woman," she challenged, her tone sharper than intended. Samuel smiled, undeterred. "Considering you're doing it alone, man or woman, that's no small feat." When they arrived at her ranch, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the modest but well-maintained buildings. A small cabin served as the main house, with a barn, corral, and bunkhouse completing the property. 2 ranch hands, the only help she could afford, came out to greet them. "Everything all right, Miss Margaret?" asked Hank, the older of the two, eyeing Samuel suspiciously. "Fine, Hank. Mr. Keller here helped me with some trouble in town. Would you mind unloading the supplies?" After the men took care of the wagon, Margaret turned to Samuel. "You're welcome to stay for supper. Least I can do to thank you." Samuel dismounted, tying Rusty to the hitching post. "That's mighty kind. I accept." Inside her modest cabin, Margaret busied herself with preparing a simple meal, aware of Samuel's eyes following her movements. She became suddenly self-conscious of her worn trousers and flannel shirt, her hair hastily tied back, and especially of her hands as she worked. "You've got a good operation here," Samuel commented, looking around the neat cabin. "Your pa would be proud." Margaret paused, a pot in her rough hands. "You knew my father," met him a few times at cattle auctions. "He spoke highly of his daughter who could outride and outwork most men." Samuel smiled. "Said you were the best thing that ever happened to him." Emotion tightened Margaret's throat. "He was a good man, taught me everything I know." When supper was ready, they sat at her small table. Margaret was keenly aware that this was the first time she'd had a man who wasn't a ranch hand to dinner since her father died. "These biscuits are excellent," Samuel said after taking a bite. "Thank you." Margaret smiled despite herself. "My mother's recipe, one of the few womanly skills I mastered before she passed." "When was that?" "I was 12. Influenza took her one winter." Margaret looked down at her plate. "Pa never remarried, said one great love was enough for any man's lifetime." Samuel nodded thoughtfully. Wise words. After dinner, they sat on the porch, watching darkness settle over the land. Stars appeared one by one in the vast Montana sky, more brilliant than any city dweller could imagine. "I should be heading back," Samuel finally said, though he made no move to leave. "It's a long ride in the dark," Margaret replied. "The bunkhouse has an extra cot if you'd like to stay." Samuel considered this. "That's kind of you, but I wouldn't want to cause talk. Your reputation," Margaret laughed, the sound genuine but tinged with bitterness. "Mr. Keller, my reputation was lost the moment I put on trousers and took over this ranch. One more night of gossip won't make much difference." He studied her face in the moonlight. "People can be cruel about things they don't understand." "Like a woman doing a man's job?" she asked. "Like anyone defying what others think they should be." Margaret was silent for a moment. "Those women in town, they weren't wrong about my hands." She held them out, palms up. "Not exactly a lady's hands." Samuel surprised her by reaching out and taking one of her hands in his. His touch was gentle as he turned her palm upward, his thumb tracing a callus. "These hands have built something from nothing, kept this ranch running when most would have sold and fled." His voice was low, sincere. "To me, they're softer than gold." Margaret pulled her hand away, uncomfortable with the intensity of his gaze and the unexpected warmth his touch had sparked. "You're being kind." "I'm being honest," Samuel replied, standing. "And now I really should go. Thank you for supper." "The offer still stands," Margaret said. "The bunkhouse is yours if you want it." In the end, Samuel accepted. Margaret lay awake that night, thinking about the strange day and the even stranger feeling in her chest when Samuel Keller had held her hand. Over the next few weeks, Margaret found herself crossing paths with Samuel more frequently than seemed coincidental. He appeared at the general store when she was buying supplies, offered to help when one of her fences needed mending, and somehow managed to be in town on the same days she chose to bring goods to market. "Are you following me, Mr. Keller?" She finally asked one afternoon after he'd helped her load feed sacks into her wagon. Samuel grinned, not bothering to deny it. "Maybe I just enjoy your company, Miss Finley." "And maybe pigs will fly," Margaret retorted, though she couldn't help the smile tugging at her lips. "Don't you have work to do at the big sky?" "I manage my time well," he replied easily. "Besides, being neighborly is part of ranch life, isn't it?" As summer progressed into fall, Margaret found herself looking forward to Samuel's visits. He never came empty-handed, bringing extra vegetables from the Big Sky's garden, lending tools she needed, or simply offering his help with tasks that required more strength than she possessed. One evening, as they sat on her porch after a long day of moving cattle to different pastures, Samuel broached a subject she'd been avoiding. "Winter's coming," he said, watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold. "Running this place alone is hard enough in good weather." Margaret stiffened. "I've managed 2 winters already." "I know you have," he replied quickly. "That's not what I meant. I was thinking the Big Sky's owner, Mr. Wilson, he's getting old, talking about selling up next spring." "Is he?" Margaret kept her voice neutral, though her mind raced with implications. If a large outfit bought the Big Sky, it could mean trouble for smaller operations like hers. "He mentioned he'd consider selling to me if I could raise the money." Samuel glanced at her. "It's a long shot, but I've been saving." "You want to buy the Big Sky?" Margaret was genuinely surprised. "That's a big undertaking for one man." Samuel nodded slowly. "It would be, which is why I've been thinking about partnerships." The word hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning Margaret wasn't sure she was ready to consider. "Samuel, just think about it," he interrupted. "Our lands border each other. Combined, we'd have one of the strongest operations in the county. You know cattle better than anyone, and I've got connections from working different spreads." "A business partnership," Margaret clarified, her heart beating strangely fast. Samuel met her eyes. "For now. Though I hope you know my admiration extends beyond your ranching skills, Margaret." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and something in the way he said it made her cheeks warm. Before she could formulate a response, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. 3 riders approached the house, and Margaret recognized them immediately: Frank Donnelly and his sons from the Diamond D Ranch, the largest spread in the territory. "Evening, Miss Finley," Frank called, tipping his hat as the 3 men reined in their horses. His gaze flicked to Samuel, eyes narrowing slightly. "Keller." "Donnelly," Samuel replied, his tone neutral but his posture straightening. "What brings you out this way, Mr. Donnelly?" Margaret asked, standing. Relations with the Diamond D had always been cordial but distant. "Just making rounds," Frank replied. "Checking on neighbors before winter sets in." He surveyed her property with calculating eyes. "Speaking of which, I came to make you an offer, Miss Finley. I'm looking to expand, and your land would fit nicely with mine." Margaret felt her body tense. "The Lazy F isn't for sale." Frank's expression hardened slightly. "Now, I understand your attachment, but be reasonable. A woman alone can't hope to compete with operations like mine, especially once winter hits." "She's not alone," Samuel said quietly, moving to stand beside Margaret. Frank's older son, Thomas, smirked. "Didn't realize you'd taken on a husband, Miss Finley, though I guess beggars can't be choosers out here." "Watch your mouth," Samuel warned, his hand drifting toward his holstered gun. "That's enough," Frank said sharply to his son before turning back to Margaret. "My offer stands. Think about it. Winter's hard on small spreads, and a woman's place is wherever she decides it is," Margaret interrupted. "Thank you for your concern, Mr. Donnelly, but my answer remains the same." The rancher studied her for a long moment, then nodded curtly. "As you wish, but when things get tough and they will remember I made a fair offer." He tipped his hat again and wheeled his horse around, his sons following. When they were out of earshot, Margaret released a shaky breath. "That's the 3rd offer I've had this year." Samuel turned to her, concern evident in his eyes. "Is the ranch in trouble?" Margaret hesitated. Pride warred with practicality, but something in Samuel's expression told her he wasn't asking out of judgment. "Not trouble exactly, but it's tight. Cattle prices are down, and I lost some stock in that storm last spring." "Why not sell?" Samuel asked softly. Not to Donnelly, but to someone. "Life would be easier." "This land was my father's dream," Margaret replied, looking out across the pastures that stretched to the distant mountains. "He came here with nothing, built something that mattered. Leaving would feel like betraying him." Samuel was quiet for a moment. What if there was a way to honor his dream without carrying the burden alone? Their eyes met, and Margaret felt something shift between them, a recognition of possibilities neither had dared voice before. Before Samuel left that evening, he took her hand again, and this time Margaret didn't pull away. His thumb traced the calluses on her palm with a reverence that made her throat tight. "I meant what I said before," he murmured. These hands tell a story of courage and determination that soft, pampered hands never could. After he'd gone, Margaret stood on her porch long into the night, looking at her hands in the moonlight and wondering if they might build something new alongside what her father had begun. The first snow came early that year, blanketing the land in white before October ended. Margaret woke to a world transformed, beautiful but ominous in its silent warning of the harsh months ahead. She had just finished her morning chores when Samuel arrived, his horse making fresh tracks in the pristine snow. "Thought you might need help checking the north pasture fence," he called, dismounting. "Snow like this can bring down weak sections." Margaret smiled, grateful but suspicious. "And you just happened to guess that was my plan for today?" Samuel grinned, shaking snow from his hat. "Maybe Hank mentioned it when I ran into him in town yesterday." They rode out together, the cold air crisp in their lungs, their breath forming clouds that vanished in the winter sunlight. The damaged fence took hours to repair, and by the time they finished, the short winter day was already fading. "We should head back before dark," Margaret said, pulling her gloves back on. Samuel nodded, but as they mounted their horses, a distant howl made them both pause. "Wolves," Margaret said quietly. "Close. Too close to the herd," Samuel agreed, his expression grim. "Hunting's probably pour up in the high country with this early snow." They changed course, riding toward where Margaret's cattle were gathered in the lower pasture. As they crested a small rise, Margaret's heart sank. 3 wolves were circling a separated group of cattle, while the main herd had bunched defensively several hundred yards away. "We need to drive them off," she said, reaching for her rifle. The next hour was chaos. Gunshots, thundering hooves, and the snarling of hungry predators filled the air as they fought to protect the herd. When it was over, the wolves had retreated, but not before bringing down a young heifer. Margaret and Samuel were exhausted, cold, and now facing a ride home in darkness. "We should butcher what we can," Samuel said pragmatically, looking at the fallen animal. "No sense wasting the meat." By the time they'd salvaged what they could and loaded it onto Margaret's horse, snow was falling again, heavy and fast. "This is turning into a proper blizzard," Margaret said, voice raised against the rising wind. "We need to get back." The journey that had taken an hour in daylight became treacherous in the storm. Visibility dwindled to mere feet in front of them, and the temperature plummeted. Margaret felt cold seeping through her clothes despite her heavy coat. "There's a line shack just over that ridge," she called to Samuel, pointing toward a dark shape barely visible through the snow. "We won't make it back to the main house in this." The small shelter had been built by her father as a refuge for just such emergencies. Inside was basic but sufficient: a small stove, cot, some emergency provisions, and firewood stacked against one wall. Samuel quickly got a fire going while Margaret tended to the horses, bringing them into the attached lean to where they'd at least be sheltered from the wind. Inside, the tiny cabin slowly warmed as the stove began to heat the space. "Your hands are blue," Samuel said with concern, taking Margaret's fingers between his own. "You should have said something sooner." "Yours aren't much better," she countered, noticing the stiffness in his movements. They sat close to the stove, sharing the cabin's single blanket as feeling painfully returned to their extremities. Outside, the storm howled like a living thing, rattling the shutters and driving snow against the windows. "Looks like we're here for the night," Samuel said, adding another log to the fire. The implication hung in the air between them. A man and woman, alone in a remote cabin, it was the sort of situation that would have tongues wagging from one end of the territory to the other. "Does that bother you?" Margaret asked, meeting his eyes directly, being stranded in a blizzard. "Can't say it's how I plan to spend the evening," he replied with a slight smile. "Being stranded with me," she clarified. "Unmarried, unchaperoned. Your reputation," Samuel laughed. "Margaret Finley, are you worried about my virtue?" Despite herself, Margaret smiled. "I'm being serious. People will talk." "Let them." Samuel's expression sobered. Unless you're concerned for your own reputation, Margaret looked down at her hands, rough and red from the cold. What reputation? The unmarriageable rancher woman with hands like a man's and more cattle than suitors. Samuel reached across the space between them, taking one of her hands in his. Unlike their previous encounters, this time he raised it to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her calloused palm. "These hands," he said softly, "have saved my life today, fed cattle through blizzards, built a life where others said it couldn't be done." His eyes, reflecting the firelight, held hers. "I've known men with soft, uncalloused hands who couldn't match half your courage, Margaret." Something broke open inside her at his words, a dam of loneliness and doubt that had been building since her father's death. "I'm tired of being strong alone," she whispered, the admission costing her more than she could say. Samuel moved closer, his hand cupping her cheek. "You don't have to be." Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, a question asked and answered in the quiet warmth of the small cabin while winter raged outside. When they parted, Margaret found herself smiling despite the tears that threatened at the corners of her eyes. "I've wanted to do that since the day you pulled that knife from your boot," Samuel admitted, his thumb tracing her cheekbone. Margaret laughed. "Most men would have run in the opposite direction." "I'm not most men," he replied simply. They talked through the night as the storm gradually subsided, sharing dreams and fears that had never before been spoken aloud. Margaret told him of her terror after her father's death, the crushing weight of responsibility, and the cold rejection she'd faced from townspeople who believed a woman had no business running a ranch. Samuel shared his own journey, orphaned young, working from Texas to Montana, saving every penny toward his dream of land he could call his own. "Why ranching?" Margaret asked as dawn's faint light began to illuminate the cabin. "It's a hard life." Samuel was quiet for a moment. "When I was a boy, my father worked another man's land. We had nothing that was truly ours. He died still owing debts to the landowner." His expression hardened. "I promised myself I'd never live or die beholden to another man." As the new day broke clear and cold, they emerged from the cabin to a transformed world. The storm had passed, leaving behind a pristine landscape of undisturbed snow stretching to the horizon. "It's beautiful," Margaret breathed, the morning sun turning the scene into a sea of diamonds. Samuel stood beside her, his arm around her waist. "Yes," he agreed, though his eyes were on her face rather than the landscape. "Beautiful." They returned to the ranch to find Hank and the other hand, Joe, nearly frantic with worry. Their relief at seeing Margaret safe quickly turned to poorly concealed curiosity about her night away with Samuel. "Storm caught us checking the north fence," Margaret explained, her tone leaving no room for questions. "We sheltered in the line shack." Hank nodded, though his knowing look spoke volumes. "Glad you're safe, Miss Margaret, Mr. Keller." In the weeks that followed, Samuel became a near-constant presence at the Lazy F. Together they prepared for the deepening winter, repairing outbuildings, ensuring adequate feed stores, and checking cattle daily. The harsh reality of winter in Montana meant that survival required vigilance and hard work. But for the first time since her father's death, Margaret didn't face it alone. Word of their relationship spread quickly through the small community. Some approved, seeing it as a practical solution to Margaret's unusual situation. Others whispered behind their hands about impropriety and Samuel's motives. "They're saying you're only after my land," Margaret told him one evening as they sat by her fireplace. Samuel's jaw tightened. "And what do you believe?" She studied his face in the flickering light. "I believe you could have courted any number of women with soft hands and proper manners. Instead, you chose the most difficult woman in 3 territories." His serious expression broke into a smile. "When you put it that way, I must be either very clever or very foolish." "Which is it?" Samuel took her hands in his, tracing the familiar calluses and strong fingers. "Clever enough to recognize the most extraordinary woman I've ever met." "Foolish enough to hope she might consider becoming my wife," Margaret's breath caught. "Samuel, I know it hasn't been long, he continued quickly. But out here, life doesn't wait for conventional courtships. I love you, Margaret. Your strength, your determination, these hands that have built something from nothing. He pressed a kiss to her palm. Marry me, not just for the practicality of combining our ranches, but because I can't imagine my life without you in it. Tears sprang to Margaret's eyes, not the tears of sadness or frustration she'd grown accustomed to, but ones of unexpected joy. Yes, she whispered. Yes. They were married on Christmas Day, 1876, in Margaret's small cabin with only Hank, Joe, and the preacher as witnesses. Margaret wore her mother's dress, carefully preserved all these years, and Samuel looked at her as though she were the most beautiful woman on earth, work, roughened hands and all. Spring brought new beginnings in more ways than one. Samuel's careful saving, combined with Margaret's business acumen, allowed them to purchase the Big Sky Ranch when old Mr. Wilson decided to retire to St. Louis. The merged operation, which they named the Keller Finley Ranch, quickly became one of the most successful in the territory. When Frank Donnelly heard the news, he rode out to see them, his expression a mixture of annoyance and reluctant respect. "Seems I underestimated you, Miss Finley, Mrs. Keller now, I suppose," he said, surveying the expanded operation. "And you as well, Keller. You've built something impressive here." "Thank you," Margaret replied, standing tall beside her husband. "Though I'll always be a Finley as well as a Keller, this land has both our names on it for a reason." Frank nodded slowly. "Times are changing, I suppose." "My offer to buy still stands, should you ever reconsider." Samuel's arm slipped around Margaret's waist. "We appreciate the interest, but this land isn't for sale. Not now, not ever." After Donnelly left, Samuel turned to Margaret with a smile. "I think you impressed him, not an easy feat." "I don't care about impressing Frank Donnelly," Margaret replied, "but I do care about honoring my father's legacy and building our own." "Our own legacy," Samuel repeated, his hand finding hers, fingers intertwining. "I like the sound of that." As the sun set over their expanded ranch, Margaret looked down at their joined hands, his strong and steady, hers calloused and capable. Different but perfectly matched, like the partnership they had formed. "Your father would be proud," Samuel said softly, following her gaze. "Of everything you've accomplished," Margaret smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Of everything we're accomplishing, together." And as the Montana sky blazed with sunset colors, Margaret knew with certainty that her hands, once mocked for their roughness, had built something precious. Not just a successful ranch, but a life filled with purpose and love that was softer than gold and stronger than the harsh land that had forged it.